Good day everyone. Time for some more maintenance work on the Kia. Today we will be tackling the full flush of the coolant. In this video I'll start by going over a bit of theory and some explanations on how coolant should be replaced, and then I'm going to do the work step by step with as much detail as possible to be as helpful as I can be to everyone out there that wants to try and do this kind of job themselves. So without further ado, let's start. Let's begin with an explanation why I think it's time for the coolant to be changed in this particular car. Well, it's fairly simple, just look at it. It seems to be black. It's actually dark green, but more importantly, you can see here at the top of the reservoir that it's already beginning to stain the inside of the reservoir, which is a clear indication that the coolant has become dirty. And preventative maintenance dictates that you should change things in general on the car as soon as they start showing problems to avoid more costly repairs later on. Moving on, let's discuss what kind of coolant I'll be using and why I chose it. If we look right here in the car's manual, it says coolant for the diesel engine. It's going to be, the capacity of the system is 8.5 liters. This is for the automatic transmission. For the, by the way, for the manual, it's a bit higher, about 8.7. And it doesn't give a specific type, but it says obviously mixture of antifreeze and distilled water. It should be a coolant based on ethylene glycol, which is compatible with aluminum because the radiator is aluminum. With that said, let's take a look at what I got. So I have a number of distilled water bottles. Strongly recommend that you use distilled water and not deionized water. This one is far more pure. We have a solution to actually clean the coolant circuit inside the car to make sure that we remove even more of the old dirt and old coolant. And then for antifreeze, I went with HEPU P999 G11. Did a bit of research earlier on the topic, one kind of coolant to choose, and I chose this one for two reasons. Number one, I inquired directly with the Kia dealer where I used to service the car, and they said that it should be G11 coolant, which must be blue in color, which this one is. And with additional research, I did check that this particular kind of coolant is indeed compatible not just with aluminum, but with other types of soft metals, solders and so on inside the car's cooling circuit. At the time of filming, the car has 152,000 kilometers, and it's only been about a week and a half since we changed the oil and filters. You can check out the video with that operation on my channel. And lastly, let's take a look at what the manual says regarding servicing. So we're with normal maintenance schedule diesel engine for Europe, as we're based in Romania. And it says that the engine coolant should be replaced first at 210,000 kilometers or 10 years. And then after every 2 years of 30,000 kilometers. Obviously, if you have signs that the coolant needs replacing, be it dirty or whatever, you should do this earlier than what they say. And before actually starting the work itself, let me just bore you for a couple of minutes with a little bit of theory. First of all, on the difference between changing and flushing the coolant. Now, these terms aren't well set in stone, but most of the times the notion of changing the coolant is typically associated with one single coolant drain and refill, whereas the notion of coolant flush typically means that you remove ideally all of the old coolant and replace it with a brand new mix. Why the difference? Well, when you drain the coolant for most modern cars, you are never really able to drain all of it in one go. You'll see a bit later when we will drain as much as we can from the bottom of the radiator. I expect that will be able to pull out around half, give or take, but we will measure exactly because we will need the actual percentage for later use. So if you just do one change, it pretty much means hypothetically that you will have half old coolant and half new coolant, which is still better than having all of it being old. But ideally, even though it takes a bit more work, I recommend doing a full flush once every couple of years, or if the coolant appears to be dirty or in need of replacement. Moving on, there are multiple ways to actually perform a coolant flush. Many of them involve the use of an external water source, i.e. something like water from a garden hose, which you connect to one of the hoses in the car, and the water combined with the pressure from the hose is theoretically supposed to push out old coolant, and you put water in until you only have clean water coming out. Personally, I'm pretty much against this kind of operation for two main reasons. Number one, all manuals say that the water you put inside your coolant system should be ideally distilled or at least deionized, depending on the car. No one recommends that you use normal tap water. The reason is tap water has all kinds of minerals inside, which when heated tend to precipitate and create various clogs inside the coolant passages of the engines, which in the worst case will block coolant from flowing and lead to engine overheat and all kinds of expensive repairs to get it all sorted out. Number two has to do with pressure. The coolant is designed to operate at the pressure given by the car's water pump, which is typically not very high. If you come with a garden hose that has a much higher pressure, you run the risk of causing all kinds of damage inside the system from, I don't know, damaging hoses, connections, and causing leaks, which then will be a headache to fix. Which is why I always do the flushes exclusively with distilled water, even if the procedure takes a bit longer. And with that said, let's move on. And let's start with a very simple operation that's not extremely relevant for the flushing, but it is relevant when you just want to check the state of the coolant, which you should do periodically. Firstly, and very, very important, do not work on the cooling system when the car is hot, because the cooling system is pressurized and the coolant itself, especially after the car has been driven for a while, is very hot, right? Around 90 to 100 degrees centigrade. Which means that if you open the coolant reservoir, there is a real risk of very hot coolant splashing and scalding you and causing injury. In our case, we have let the car cool down for about an hour. Everything is safe to the touch. The coolant level has dropped a bit as well, because when it is hot, the entire area that's dirty is actually covered. And we proceed with opening the coolant reservoir. It just says engine coolant here, so you can't mistake it for anything else. And now let's check the state of the coolant as it is. We have this small device, which is very cheap to buy. And let's see what we got. Okay, this is full. I actually need to drop it down a bit. And with the needle at the center, it tells us that the temperature of the coolant is around minus 45 degrees. And minus 45 degrees actually means that it's about 55 to 60% coolant in the mix and only about 45 to 40% water. When we're gonna do the flush, we wanna aim for 50-50 because this is absolutely sufficient for Romania. We don't really get extremely low temperatures around here. Okay, let's drain this. And then in order to start working on the coolant system, we need to first remove the underbody shield, which, as you've seen in hopefully in other videos, in the case of this car is made of metal. So give me a couple of minutes to remove it and then we'll continue. And now I'm underneath the car, and at the bottom right corner of the radiator, as I'm looking at it, you will see this white plastic pepcock. which you normally need to turn, you should be able to turn it by hand. If not, just get a pair of pliers or something, but make sure that the metal lips of the pliers are covered in something soft like insulation tape or something, because you don't want to grip that plastic with metal too hard because you might rip it. But in any case, I am trying to open it, and there we go. I've actually managed to twist it just using my fingers, so that's good. And the idea is that you twist that one until coolant will start dripping from around this area. By the way, I would recommend that you count the number of turns that you twist the pepcock, so you know how many turns you have to twist it the other way when you reinstall it. And then any moment now, there it goes. And I actually remove the pepcock altogether. Here it is. And I'm just gonna let the coolant drain for as much as possible. And if we want to make it even quicker, we need to remove this radiator cap, which we twist 45 degrees, like more than 90 degrees nearly, and then press on it and twist a bit further, and it comes out. And now the draining speed has increased considerably. And just talking about old coolant, just take a look at the dirt particles that we have inside. I actually have a bit more over here. So it really is a good idea that we're doing this flush. And a good 10 minutes later, the coolant has drained inside the reservoir. I've installed the bottom white pepcock back in its place, tightening it by hand. And now I'm going to install the reservoir cap. There we go. And just tighten like that. And now we need to empty the coolant reservoir. And with the coolant reservoir, I actually want to touch on an interesting subject. If you happen to take a look at the coolant flush for the Corsa, you'll notice that the Corsa's coolant reservoir has two pipes, one at the top, one at the bottom. And it's conceptually quite simple what they do, right? The one at the top flows into the reservoir, and the one at the bottom pulls coolant from the reservoir as the system needs it. This one, however, if you look at it, only has one pipe. So what's the catch? Well, it all has to do with this radiator cap, which is very important, because the theory is, as the coolant heats up and the system is sealed and pressurized, excess coolant will flow through this pipe over here into the reservoir. And then when you stop the car and the coolant cools down, there will be a vacuum created as the coolant contracts from the reduction of temperature. And that vacuum is actually going to pull the excess coolant from the reservoir through the same hose back into the radiator. So that's how the whole system works. And what we now need to do is we now need to take the reservoir and empty it as well, for which we have two screws. One is over there and another one is over here. These are both 10mm screws, which we remove. And now the last thing to remove is this hose, for which I strongly recommend that you use a plastic piece to gently separate it from the reservoir and not something metallic, because this is plastic and it may have become brittle over time. And this also, due to age, may become brittle and prone to cracks, and the plastic tool is much more gentle at removal. Here I'm removing the small hose and the coolant cap, and then I'm just taking the reservoir. Oh yeah, don't forget to disconnect it from this plastic clip down there, and just take the coolant reservoir out. See, as I said, no other hoses, and just dump the additional contents inside the container. you may need to shake it a bit. And when all is done, I'm going to analyze what we got. Don't worry about the oily look at the top. That's simply because this container is also used for draining oil, as you can see in the other video. And here's what I got. I measured the volume precisely using this glass. And what I got is 3.7 liters of coolant. These particular bottles should be transparent, and you can see from them that the coolant is extremely darkened. It has a greenish tint to it, but otherwise it is pretty filthy. And with that said, let's proceed to the next step. Now, what does the next step imply? Well, I'm simply going to do a number of cycles where each cycle consists of me adding pure distilled water to the radiator all the way to the top, then driving the car for a while to make sure that the new water mixes with whatever old coolant is still inside the system. I am going to drive at least until the car reaches the operating temperature, plus some additional 10-15 minutes. Then drain everything and repeat as many cycles as I need until what I drain looks about as clean as the normal distilled water. And before I install the coolant reservoir back, I just want to show you what its current state is. You see now, even though it's empty, how dirty it is on the inside. Furthermore, if you look inside it, not sure if, there you go. You can see there's some amount of gunk that has formed over time, and we'll have to address that a bit later. But until then, I'm gonna do what I said. I'm gonna install this and then just add water. And I'm first adding water to the reservoir until it reaches the middle between low and full. Then I can close the reservoir and fill the rest through the radiator cap. A quick tip here: when you're doing the fill up, add water slowly and at the same time press on the radiator hoses to purge as much air out as you can. And I know I need to add about 3 point something liters. And you can hear the air gurgling as it's coming out. And now the water has reached the base of the funnel, and I'm gonna grab one of the air hoses and just squeeze it, and the water level subsequently drops a bit, and I keep topping up until there's no more air to bleed. And silly me, I forgot to add the radiator cleaning agent to the system, which is why I proceeded to remove half a liter of coolant. And you can also already see that it's fairly diluted, because this is just the new water that I've added plus whatever coolant was left on the walls of the radiator. So that's good. And now I'm gonna add this. By Licky Moly, I've used it on the Corsa as well. Proved to be pretty good. The theory with this is you add it to the system, wait for the engine to warm up, then drive for additional 10 to 30 minutes to make sure that the cleaning agent circulates throughout the engine, radiator, all pipes, etc., etc. And then you have to take it out. And we do this now at the first step because I expect to have a good number of drain cycles, which should be sufficient time to drain the cleaning agent as well. And one last mention, make sure that you turn the heater inside the car to maximum in order to ensure that all the fluid circulates through the heater matrix or heat exchanger as well. So let me add the cleaner slowly. Should be enough room because I drained half a liter and this thing only has 300 milliliters. And it went all in as expected. And now I'm going to top up with some additional distilled water. I drove for about 40 minutes and 35 kilometers. I should have driven for only about 30 minutes, but I got stuck in a traffic jam. So that was fun. I let the car cool down, and now I'm doing the second drain. And as you can see, the coolant is already a bit cleaner, more diluted, but more importantly, the foam that you see is actually the cleaning agent that we added earlier. And also the coolant reservoir, which initially only had water, now got a bit darker and also has some coolant in it. And I'm gonna wait for the second drain to finish, and I'm gonna do another round of measurements. And here's the status. As you can see, the mix is now much lighter in color. The freezing temperature has dropped from, it used to be above minus 43 centigrade, and it's now hovering around minus 18, minus 20, which makes sense because we've diluted it. From this point on, as I said, I'm just going to repeat this cycle where I fill with water, drive the car, drain, fill, etc. until I'm only going to get clean water during a drain. And even though I'm going to repeat myself, I will re-emphasize, please do not forget to turn your heater on, air conditioning off, and the heater should be set to the highest temperature and the highest possible fan speed so that you get the maximum circulation of coolant and water through the heater matrix. I'll do the other drain cycles offline, and I'll come back to you in a day or so when I finish. And here we are 1 day later, after 11 drains and topping ups with only distilled water, and this is how it looks like right now. As you can see, it's not perfectly water-like. In fact, it will be impossible for it to be perfectly water-like no matter how many times you drain it. But we've reached a point where the liquid is very, very clear. You'll see at the end the comparison between how it was at the start versus how it looks now. And we're just gonna double check the fact that this is effectively just water by measuring its density with our little tool. Okay, and if you now look, see if you can see it, I'll bring it a bit to the front. If you now look, see, the needle is, it should be like this. The needle is all the way down where effectively 0 degrees Celsius should be, which corresponds to the fact that this is just water. Which is perfect because it means now we're going to start adding the concentrated antifreeze. And do note that on average we have removed about 3.3 to 3.4 liters of coolant with each individual drain. This means that we will not be able to reach a 50-50 mix of coolant and water with only one fill of coolant, because we'll only be able to add about 3.3 to 3.4 liters of coolant, but we will also need obviously one more drain and fill. And even though it's nighttime, I want to add the antifreeze now, because tonight it's going to be about 0 degrees Celsius, and since I only have water inside, I don't want the water to freeze inside the engine. I could end up having a cracked engine. So whether I like it or not, I have to add the antifreeze right now. And the important thing to note at this step is also to measure how much antifreeze you're adding, because we'll need the number for a bit of math later on, i.e. when we do the second drain and fill with antifreeze, in order to make sure we reach the desired water to antifreeze percentage. So just as before, go on and put the antifreeze slowly to make sure that the air in the system has a path out, and take your time. And when you get near the 2-liter mark, meaning that you've added 3 liters, start pouring even slower, and keep an eye out for the top of the radiator, trying not to spill any of it. Because as I said in the beginning, this thing is based on ethylene glycol, which is extremely, extremely toxic. And the radiator is right now full, and this is roughly the level, so about 3.1 liters of antifreeze got in. But I also need to add a bit more to the expansion tank over there. The rough percentage right now, it's about 2/3 filled with water, so I'll add another third of antifreeze. And that's it, all done. I'm gonna close everything up, make extra sure to close the cap for the expansion tank as well as the radiator cap properly. And time for me to make one more trip out to make sure that the existing water mixes with the newly added antifreeze. And I will catch you all in the morning. And welcome to the next morning, which is very cold. So, drove the car yesterday for a while, about half an hour, 30 kilometers, to make sure everything mixed up properly. And now it's time to check the results. So first, let's see what we're expecting. Since we got about 3.2 liters of pure antifreeze to the 8.5 liters of the entire system, that works out to 37% concentration of antifreeze based on the freezing temperature charts that I read. This should correspond roughly to somewhere around minus 20 degrees Celsius freezing temperature of the mix. And let's see what our densimeter tells us. Let's see if we're right or we're horribly wrong. We're gonna check the mix directly in the radiator. And let's see. All right. Now, would you look at that? So it should be vertical with the needle in the center. And it's saying a little bit lower than minus 18. So it's between minus 18 and minus 23, which is pretty much spot on. So we got the math right, which means that all we need to do now is do one more drain, which is going to be partial, and add some more antifreeze. But in order to figure out just how much we need to drain, we need to do some boring math. So the point of this little exercise is for us to determine how much of the existing coolant mixture we have to drain and replace with concentrated coolant so that we reach a new coolant concentration around 50%. So let's go. Let VT be the total volume of coolant in the system, which we get from the manual, and this will be 8.5 liters. Let VA be the current volume of antifreeze inside the existing mixture, which we determined from the previous fill, which is about 3.1 to 3.2 liters. Okay. Then let PA be the percentage of antifreeze that is currently present inside the car. This is simply VA divided by VT, and we're going to approximate this to 0.37, which is about 37%, as we have already verified. And lastly, let's note VAF to mean the final antifreeze volume after we do this last drain and fill. And we want this to be between 4.25 and let's say somewhere around 4.5 liters. If we have 4.25 liters of antifreeze, that's exactly half of the total volume. So that would give us a 50% concentration. And then 4.5 would give us about 53% antifreeze concentration. And we now want to determine Vx, which is the volume of this last drain that we will be doing. We're going to drain Vx liters of mixture, and we will pour Vx liters of 100% concentrated antifreeze. So we need to solve for Vx in relation to VAF. So let's do that. After we drain Vx liters, we're gonna have Vt minus Vx liters in the system. Multiplied by Pa will give us the remaining volume of antifreeze in the system after draining Vx. And if we then add Vx liters of antifreeze, we want to reach VAF. So if we just write this in a different way, we're going to get that Vx equals VAF minus Vt times Pa divided by 1 minus Pa. And if we approximate this with the numbers that we have, this means it will be approximately 1.59 times VAF minus about 5. Cool, so let's plug in some numbers. If we want VAF to be 425 liters, that means Vx will be approximately 1.76 liters. If we want VAF to be 4.5 liters, then Vx will be approximately 2.16 liters. Which is pretty nice because for the sake of simplicity, we're gonna aim for Vx of approximately 2 liters because that's very easy to measure. And that will actually give us a final volume of about 4.4 liters of antifreeze in the mix, which is about 52%. And with these numbers, we're gonna go back in the car, drain 2 liters of the mix, and put in 2 liters of concentrated antifreeze. Here I am underneath the car again for the final drain. And one important thing that I forgot to mention with the earlier computation is that thing only works if the coolant and water mix is 100% homogeneous. That's why it was so important for me to actually drive the car after each top up with water, because we need to be certain that the concentration of antifreeze is the same in the volume we have drained as well as in what's left inside the rest of the car. Okay, enough about that. This time I don't have my container, instead I have the measuring glass, because as I said, we're looking for exactly 2 liters. So I'm gonna let this thing drain. So fill the glass twice, and then we are done draining. And here's the 2nd liter drained. Look at that lovely color. And now I'm going to tighten the drain bolt, the plastic one, by hand. You actually don't need any tools for this, because you just tighten and tighten and tighten, and at some point you'll feel that you can't tighten any further. and then you simply stop. I think that's it. And now it's filling time. And just take a look at how lovely this new antifreeze looks. So, liter number 1, just as I said before, pour slowly. Apparently the rooster in the background agrees with me. Oh, that's nice. And the filling is done. I actually did struggle a little, simply because, as I mentioned earlier, you have to pour slowly, otherwise you add air into the system, and because I didn't really pour as slowly as I should have, even though I drained 2 liters, in the first fill I only got 1.6 liters of antifreeze, and then I had to squeeze the pipes, turn on the engine, and so on to be able to add the remaining amount. But anyway, that's done. The radiator cap is back on. And as a side note, I will be replacing the cap, even though nothing seems to be wrong with it, just because the car has 8 years and 150,000 kilometers. So preventative maintenance would dictate that I replace it before other bigger issues appear. And with that said, I want to give that one a good clean, because it's still quite dirty inside, as I'll show you in a few minutes. Here's the expansion tank removed. As you can see, this is the level of antifreeze, which should be bright blue, but you only see it as dark, plus the exterior dirt and whatnot. So I want to clean this and hopefully make it look as new. And this is how the cleaned reservoir looks like. I cleaned the exterior, I cleaned the interior as best I could. The best solution I found for cleaning the interior was to use some toilet cleaner, which has hydrochloric acid inside, and that did a pretty good job at dissolving all the dirt and gunk at whatever was in there, but it did not affect the plastic. This is polypropylene, and the acid was 10% concentrate, so no damage there. I wasn't able to remove this color stain, but this is not dirt. This is simply plastic discoloration due to age and temperature. And I'm content with leaving this as it is. This is very, very good and much, much better than it was before. So, time to put it back and fill it up with coolant. And let's tighten the 2 bolts that hold the reservoir in place, both of them 10mm hex. Don't tighten too hard, because plastic. That's one. That's 2. And the last thing, connect the coolant hose. That should first of all slip in here, like so, and then just connect it to the reservoir all the way to the back. Done. Now let's fill this up with coolant. I measured the volumes. It's 200 milliliters to the low level and about 650 milliliters to the high level. We're gonna add about 500 milliliters, 50% antifreeze and the rest water. We add roughly 250 milliliters of antifreeze and about 250 milliliters of distilled water. That's it. Mix them both well, and let's go pour the mix. And indeed, you can tell that the reservoir is much cleaner, because you can now actually see the color of the coolant, whereas before it was just mostly black. Cool, let's drive. And here's the result after driving for a while, for a couple of days. You see that the mix is at actually slightly below -37, with the red indicator needle pointing towards the center of the densimeter, as indicated. So it's at -37, actually even lower than -37, which means that the mix is pretty close to 50-50, as we were hoping. So we did get the math pretty right, which is very good. It means that we're done with the flush and we can now move on. Summarizing the work, I performed 11 drains and fills with distilled water, followed by the last drain and fill, which was with coolant exclusively. And this is what we got. This one was the first drain. You can't really tell it was green anymore. This was drain number 3, drain number 5, number 7, number 9, number 11, and this was the last drain when I had already put the first couple of liters of antifreeze inside the system. And I think the progress is really nice, as you can see. Now maybe 11 drains and fills are a little too much. I could have just stopped maybe at 7, 8, or maybe even 9, because mathematically beyond 7 and 8 you have more than 95% pure water, and only lower than 5% is actually old antifreeze. But I did it for the sake of thoroughness and also for the sake of this video, so I can give you as detailed results as I can. And with that said, let's move on to the conclusions, where I will be spending a bit of time because I want to touch on several topics. So, beginning long and boring conclusions discussion. And I will start with the discussion on cost this time. And let's see what we have. So we have about 15 euros for the 7 bottles of 5 liters of distilled water each, 25 euros for the 5 plus 1.5 liter concentrated coolants, about 10 euros for the leaky moly flush over there, and about 10 euros for the fuel, because as I explained, I had to drive the car between drains and fills, which equates to about 60 euros in total, give or take a little bit. Now, if you were to go to a dealership and ask for a full flush, at least around where I live, I didn't hear any of them doing the procedure that I did, which is actually the procedure as recommended by the Kia service manual, because it actually can take a lot of time. They will perform one drain and fill for you, which costs about 20 euros. So if you were to multiply that by the amount of times that I did the drains and fills, which was about 12 times, that would equate roughly to about 250 euros, which is quite a lot. There are obviously other solutions to do a full flush, as I explained at the beginning. The most common one being that you remove the thermostat and you put the garden hose in and you push all the water and coolant out as you add water from the garden hose in. As I explained, that's not the method that I like, because I only want to have pure distilled water in the system at all times. A quick mention on the driving part. Indeed, the service manual recommends that you just start the car and let it idle until it reaches operating temperature, and then you wait for a few more minutes to hear the fans turn on. But to be honest, because I wanted to make absolutely sure that the mix between water and coolant is always homogeneous, I always chose to drive the car for 10 to 15 minutes each time. I think it's a safer bet. You can choose to do or choose not to do this. It depends on your personal preference. And obviously, if you choose not to drive, you will reduce the fuel costs a little bit, but those weren't really high enough to begin with. So as I said, just about 10 euros in fuel. Also, I would recommend, if you want to do this flush on your own, that you do it in the spring or in autumn, i.e. avoid too low or too high at temperatures, meaning you avoid winter or summer, because in the winter, if you only have just water, you're in the middle of your drains and fields and you only have just water, there is a risk of that water freezing and, you know, breaking apart the engine block, which would be a huge pain to fix. And in the summer, if you have just water, you lower the overall boiling temperature of the mix, in which point the engine may overheat. So do be careful with this. Concerning the small radiator cap that I kept reusing, as I explained, I will be replacing this with a new one in the next couple of days. I already have it ordered from the dealer, because the radiator cap should be replaced no later than about 5 years, or maybe 100 to 150,000 kilometers, as part of preventative maintenance at least. Because what can happen is, if that thing no longer works properly, it will no longer hold pressure, and that will again reduce the overall boiling point of the coolant mix, which can lead to engine overheating situations. Second to last mention, in case you're wondering why I did not use the same flush technique for the coolant as I used in the Corsa video, well, it's simply because there are two cooling system architectures in cars. The old style, which is similar to what the Kia has, where you have one radiator with a radiator cap, and then the coolant expansion tank, which is only connected by one hose and it's not pressurized. And for that one, you can't pour in new fluid and expect it to circulate through the engine before it drains. If we would have done that, whatever thing we would have poured in would have drained immediately at the bottom. Whereas in the case of the Corsa, it's on a newer cooling system architecture, where whatever coolant you put in the expansion tank circulates through the engine before it runs out of the radiator. And the last, which is also the most important observation, is please supervise all the drains and fills, i.e. stay near the car, because coolant, especially coolant based on ethylene glycol, is extremely toxic, and it's also sweet, which means it can attract animals that may drink it, or heaven forbid children, and that would absolutely kill them. This is also why, as you can see, I've stored all the drained coolant in bottles, and I didn't leave it out in the open anywhere. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you liked my videos. Have a nice day, and I will see you all next time. Bye.